everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
We have about $130 billion a year we spend on nature globally. We estimate that we need about $700 billion a year. That's a global estimate, so real big numbers. But when you look at what percentage that is of the global GDP, it's less than 1%, even if we had all the money that we had, that we need. And so, what we do with the rest of that money that we spend in the GDP, a lot of it harms nature. And so just, looking at what finance instruments, what economic tools we can use to help align the interests of the private sector, align the interests of government and individuals, households, and things to have a more positive relationship with nature is the most efficient and economical approach. So as much as we want to raise more money for nature, we really need to take a big systemic look at it and say, what's the most efficient initiatives? What are the most efficient actions we can take to improve our relationship with nature?
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by David Meyers, Executive Director of Conservation Finance Alliance. Welcome to the show today.
Nice to be here, Scott.
Now, you've lived and worked in many nations, one of which is Madagascar. I wonder what that was like.
It's an amazing place. If you're interested in nature, it's one of these paradises, and with everything's endemic for the most part, incredibly strange creatures like chameleons and leaf-tailed geckos, and of course the lemurs are what brought me there in the first place, which are just an amazing group of primates that branched off from the rest of our primate lineage probably like 50 million years ago, 60 million years ago. So it's quite a spectacular place, and the people are just wonderful as well, and friendly, and just trying to get by.
Sounds amazing, and of course, it has its own host of issues as well. But what a beautiful place to be, and I think that's a really great launching point to talk about the work that you're doing and the impact to nature. Now, before Conservation Finance Alliance, you served as a senior technical advisor for the biodiversity finance initiatives at UNDP. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's a really fantastic program. It's been going on since about 2012, and currently works in about 41 countries. And the idea is to look at biodiversity finance from a national level. And we primarily, worked with governments and other actors working in that space to try to identify what the finance needs are, what the current financial flows to nature are, and that spans the full range of different sectors, because biodiversity and nature interact with so many different sectors. And then come up with ultimately a finance plan that seeks to identify opportunities that the government can lead on, or private sector can lead on, to improve how nature is financed and managed through a whole range of finance mechanisms. And now they just were sort of cited in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they're going to expand to an additional 100 countries. So this idea of a biodiversity finance plan is something that will then be greatly expanded and used globally.
Well, that's very exciting. And I think that speaks to what we're going to be talking about at the CFA, which is really a organization for supporting a vibrant personal community of conservation finance experts and practitioners. Again, all those countries still requires the individuals, people on the ground to make this work. So first, tell us about CFA and what it's doing to help enhance and expand some of these conservation finance programs.
Sure. The Conservation Finance Alliance has been around for about 20 years. It was started in 2002, and I joined in 2018 as the first executive director. It's a hosted organization, so it's sort of a global network of practitioners in conservation finance. And our mission is to build capacity, share knowledge, and support innovation in conservation finance, this is an area that, of course, every conservation action needs financing, needs money. So that's what first thing people think of. But in fact, there's a range of finance tools that can be used to achieve conservation outcomes. And so we try to get organizations like the big NGOs who are expert in some of these instruments to share their knowledge through webinars and through working groups and publications, and try to really build the capacity, because the ambitions that the world has set out now to greatly expand protected areas and bring nature more, and bring business more in line with nature, really need a full range of tools. There's a reason that we've been struggling with achieving these outcomes, and so these tools are essential to sort of take the ecological and economical value of nature and convert that into some sort of financial flow that is then used to better manage those resources. So, I can go in more detail, but yeah.
Yeah, I think you hit on the nail, which is this increase of capacity. So to solve some of the climate change kind of broader conservation efforts, this is massive, because this is not just localized, it's not even regional, it's global scale, and they're also very different as well. They're very heterogeneous and very specific to those local regions. So capacity building is very critical. And to that point, we've been talking about the term conservation finance, and I'm thinking people may be thinking in the back of their heads, things like green bonds, but it's a little bit more specific, isn't it? It's something to the extent of helping to develop mechanisms and strategies that generate, manage, and deploy these financial tools and align those incentives to achieve nature conservation outcomes. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Sure. As I say, a lot of people think about conservation funds. They think about how do we fundraise for our conservation project, for a park, for something like that. But the fundraising is only part of it. It's important that you manage and deploy your resources efficiently and effectively. And currently, there's quite a lot of money being spent on things like agricultural production, and countries provide a lot of subsidies for fertilizer, things like that. So just in reorienting some of those financial flows, you can have huge impact. For example, directing some farming subsidies towards more green farming or regenerative agriculture, things like that, could have the same production outcomes, but with much less damage to nature. Therefore, and improving nature in some cases. Planting hedgerows or complex flowers by the edges of agricultural fields result in more pollinators, and in fact is a sort of net positive outcome. And the other big piece that is often overlooked is about aligning incentives. If you look at, say we have about $130 billion a year we spend on nature globally. We estimate that we need about $700 billion a year. That's global estimate, so real big numbers. But when you look at what percentage that is of the global GDP, it's less than 1%, even if we had all the money that we had, that we need. And so, what we do with the rest of that money that we spend in the GDP, a lot of it harms nature. And so just, looking at what finance instruments, what economic tools we can use to help align the interests of the private sector, align the interests of government, and individuals, households, and things to have a more positive relationship with nature is the most efficient and economical approach. So as much as we want to raise more money for nature, we really need to take a big systemic look at it and say, what's the most efficient initiatives? What are the most efficient actions we can take to improve our relationship with nature?
One of the things that I've learned over time is that optimization doesn't quite work in the real world per se. Maybe in economic books and theoretical frameworks, sure. And you talked about trade, and in some case, I think your underlying is protectionism. So in the case of, let's say, export-oriented sectors, like agriculture, for instance. So, it's not just simply about changing some of these subsidies. It's really lobbying, isn't it? It's getting to kind of hard lines around political parties and ideology around things that they've historically done, like subsidizing pesticides or subsidizing fertilizers, chemical fertilizer, things that are, we know, harms the environment, has, cascading effects down to the ocean level. So how do we change that? And then the bigger question you were asking really is that the 99% of the GDP, global GDP, is being spent on something else that typically has a negative externality And what are we doing about that? And then you got these ideological, things cropping up around anti-woke movements, for example, and removing capital away from some of these state funds and state pensions and so forth. How do we overcome some of these things when optimization is very elusive?
Yeah, I mean, and I agree with what you're saying, and we have a hard time even getting to an optimization discussion. We're so far behind the eight ball with regard to nature and our relationship with it and finance for it. So, I mean, there are a couple of points that are interesting here. One is that the governments need to take a whole of government approach to start to figure this out. So try to understand their natural capital assets, and there are a lot of groups out there that try to support the quantification of that. Ministries often work in isolation, isolated silos, getting them together to talk about these issues, to plan, to strategize, enables recognition of opportunities that are just right there on the table that don't cost much money. We talk a lot about how limited national budgets are, for example, limited fiscal space, but a lot of it can be done just by better communication, having the right people at the table, and this sort of whole of government approach. There are some really interesting initiatives right now. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, for example, is seeking to create a standard disclosure template for material impacts and dependencies on nature that would ultimately, have companies reporting on this. And some jurisdictions, they may require companies, publicly traded companies especially, and just, being obliged or just incentivized to report your impacts and dependencies on nature helps bring that into the business models in ways that companies generally don't, because these are external. I mean, water, tends to be free, for example. We don't think about or low cost, let's say. We don't think about the watersheds. We don't think about the long term. This is the role of government. But governments, as you said, they're pulled in all these directions. There's political challenges, and so it's hard. Sometimes it seems that the private sector, the leaders out there, are much more advanced than the governments, and the governments are working to catch up. So it really we need to kind of just get those leading companies to let governments know that, hey, regulation is okay. We want a level playing field. We want to be supported in our sustainability efforts, and not just see them as a cost.
So I really like this notion of leading with private sector first, and of course, ultimately, I think, as you mentioned, it's a blended finance for nature that involves the private public sector as well as the communities. But I really like that approach of the private sector. Now, the challenge is, as we are very much at the doorsteps of a global recession, is that many companies are trimming back on their ESG and other types of budgets oriented towards some of these conservation efforts. So that's a real issue. The other issue is there's a bit of lopsidedness in the sense that you have Scandinavian countries and certainly Western Europe within the EU that are very much proactive around these thoughts and tools and best practices sharing when it comes to conservation finance. But the rest of the world isn't necessarily there yet, including the US. And then certainly as you go into developing and least develop, you then have bigger issues around corruption, which even further complicates some of these challenges. And I'm sure being at the UNDP, you saw a lot of those issues. How do we navigate around these messiness?
Yeah, it's obviously not an easy question. I think that one area that's around transparency is really important. Trying to be clear about what your targets are, what your outcomes are, how you're spending your money, how you're reporting it. And we do a lot of work with conservation trust funds, and part of their value is that they sit outside the government. They're independent foundations, effectively, that are targeted towards nature. And they're transparent about what they're spending their money on. They're transparent about their impacts and management, and there's follow good governance rules and things like that. That gives an example of what kind of leadership could look like. There's so many challenges that we're facing. So corruption is definitely one of them, but it is a risk globally. And a lot of the developing world still relies very heavily on natural resources. For example, in Africa, fuel wood is a huge source of cooking energy. And so in many ways, some of the developing countries recognize how important natural resource management is for their economies in future. And we just, I think in the developed world, the initiatives that you mentioned in EU and Scandinavia to reduce deforestation imports, for example, these have huge impacts. And the markets. And you look at the U.S., it's a huge market, and we have a huge impact on all the sourcing of the material that we consume and purchase and buy. And so if you do, and another point is that a lot of the brands and the big, publicly traded companies have enormous power over those supply chains. And so they can have huge impacts if they require improved sustainability, if they require improved attention to nature, if they themselves look at their impacts and dependencies and then make strategic investments. And this is not just, corporate social responsibility. It's not just philanthropy. It's strategic investment to assure long-term supply chain stability and price stability and things like that. So I think we're moving there. There's been a transformation over the last 2 years where nature's really come to the forefront. People are recognizing how important it is. And so now we need to go from talk to action, and that's a challenge.
Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I do think that the tipping point has been reached, and we're at a very exciting point, and there is momentum. I want to get a little bit more granular in terms of some of the conservation finance kind of framework and some of the details. Can you talk about the 4 main outcomes when it comes to conservation finance solutions?
4 main outcomes for solutions. So we've got a framework, that comes from the Biodiversity Finance Initiative that looks at, the first one is sort of being more effective and efficient with the money that you have. That's really important. The second one is to try to reduce the harms that are driving costs, basically. So this is probably the most, as I mentioned before, cost-effective way of achieving conservation outcomes is reduce that pressure and the harm. The third is to look for partners that could have positive impact, and think about actors and how you stimulate positive investment and interest and aligned interest in nature. And then the fourth one is the one everyone focuses on, which is raising money. So those are the kind of 4 main filters we say. And when you're looking at a site or a problem, it's really useful to look through all those different filters rather than just go straight to how can we raise money for this outcome, because you could be spending effort and time that you don't need.
Yeah, I think that's a very sound framework to help rationalize some of these things, and to your point, not go directly to some of the financial vehicles. Now, with that said, at the end of the day, it really is, finance is a big component of that. I wonder if you could talk about the different types of investment vehicles that ranges from, I believe, microfinance, P2P, PVC, to even different types of debt, for instance.
Yeah, and so this comes from like the part of the conservation finance spectrum where you have private return based products, and there's been mention of limited financing available, and so everyone's looking to the private sector and thinks that we could then greatly expand the money that we're spending on nature by getting the private sector to invest. One of the challenges, though, is that environment is generally externalities and public goods, and it's kind of hard to generate revenue from keeping things intact. Much easier to cut down a tree and sell it than to figure out a way to keep it there. So, but there's enormous interest in this, and some of the approaches that there's everything from debt is really an important area here. And for debt, there's things like debt conversion, where a country that's distressed in terms of its public debt can look to convert that with a better rate. You get a development finance institution like the World Bank or someone coming in providing a loan guarantee or kind of an investment guarantee that de-risks that. And then private investors could come in and get a really good corporate bond or a public bond that's guaranteed by the World Bank or other development finance institutions that has a nature-based outcome. So the Nature Conservancy, TNC, done a lot of work with this, and had a great success with Belize, and a lot of that money that is generated from the savings is going into blue conservation, so marine and coastal conservation, as well as Barbados just did a deal like that, but also just direct investment. Nature-based businesses tend to be they're not like technology businesses where there's high returns and high risk. They tend to be relatively lower risk but relatively lower returns, so they're really ideal for debt type instruments. Mm-hmm. So maybe sustainability linked loans could be used to incentivize both governments and companies to achieve specific outcomes. And there's quite a range of other products. And I think microfinance is also an area that historically has been used for, facilitating access to capital and rural and remote areas where it's not available. But if you can tie that into environmental management, great opportunities there for touching the people on the ground. That's the real challenge. You can do big bond issuances and green bonds, and but how do you get the money down to the people on the ground? That's the big challenge.
Now, speaking of structured finance with focus on debts, is that we've come from an era of essentially free borrowing, right, because of the monetary policy aspects. But now we're starting to see increasing interest rate, not just in the US, but throughout the world. How is that going to have an impact on some of these bond issuance and green bonds?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of that's yet to be seen. We've come out of a tough period for the global economy, especially those economies dependent on tourism. So you have quite a number of countries who are debt stressed right now, and they're looking at then borrowing at the current rates, which, as are increasing, right? So when you can come in and provide some sort of debt relief, I think that is the key. And if you can lower the bond rates, for example, through risk mitigation and kind of financial guarantees, that's going to become very attractive to the countries. And so where nature can benefit from that, I think that's great.
That's actually very interesting. In a way, what I'm hearing is that it actually increases incentive. And I'm going to just throw out a couple of countries which may not be necessarily appropriate per se in the context, but Lebanon, Sri Lanka, some of these other countries that are really having, macro country level issues. But as they think about restructuring, thinking about conservation finance into that restructuring process and maybe getting these guarantees that helps lower the cost of borrowing. So very interesting. I want to talk about some of the case studies. One in particular is the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, and this is just to help the audience to get a better concreteness around how is this blended finance instrument working to help mobilize action and resources, protect and restore coral reefs using the frameworks that we just talked about.
Yeah, as you know, everyone is learning. Coral reefs are one of the most threatened global ecosystems and provide enormous value. So, it's a real challenge to try to support them. And so this model basically seeks to leverage private and market-based mechanisms as much as possible. And so there are a range of philanthropic donors, public entities like governments, the UK, Germany, France, for example, that have put money into this grant fund side. And that grant fund provides obviously grants, but also technical assistance and concessional loans through the United Nations Capital Development Fund, which is a fund that traditionally has been focused on least developed nations. Anyway, that they're able to provide heavily concessional loans to small businesses that have a positive impact on nature. And so the programs are starting off, they're country-based or regional, and they identify partners that are able to provide technical assistance, provide low-cost financing targeted to businesses, and finance instruments that are positive for nature. So you have things like, and in this case, there are not many models that work on pure conservation. There is a group called Blue Finance that uses impact investing to complement grants and other financing for marine protected areas. paying back the investment by charging for entrance fees and diving fees and tourism operations. So that's a model that's been used on land. It's now being used in the ocean for high tourist interest areas. But a lot of other values from keeping nature in place are not monetizable. They don't generate revenue streams. And so we're looking at opportunities like aquaculture, sustainable fisheries, obviously ecotourism, that are investable. And there's actually a private equity fund that's associated with the Global Fund. It's part of it, and they work very closely with the grant fund, and that's run by a group called Pegasus Capital Advisors. And they're looking for large private equity opportunities, and so they're exploring a big ecotourism lodge, and they're exploring waste management opportunities, things like that. They require heavy investment, and they could reach a scale that's interesting. And in between, there's so many different opportunities for investment all around businesses that reduce harm, that reduce impact, that protect restoration, that help local communities improve their relationship with the coral reefs. So it's quite interesting.
It's very exciting, and I think underlying all of this is human creativity and ingenuity, and allowing for these smaller parties as well as larger ones, including some of these Ps you mentioned, to come up with really profound solutions that can have a win-win for all the different parties involved. So with that, I have been joined by David Meyers, Executive Director of Conservation Finance Alliance. Thank you for joining today.
My pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.